Now move on to our second speaker, who is David Cundall. And David is going to talk to us about the Leeds Preventorium from 1925 to 1939, shielding children from tuberculosis, but the title ends, but ... which is rather intriguing. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Alan, for allowing me to spend some time with the Society. I'm a relatively new member. Is everybody hearing me okay? Presume they are, yes. I used to be a community paediatrician in this fair city and retired early in 2011. 30 years before that, in 1981, I caught TB when I was a hard-pressed junior doctor at Jimmy's. So I've been fascinated by tuberculosis ever since. My interest in the Hollies, the Preventorium there, was initially kindled by the late Dr. David Charley, who told me about it round about that time, I guess. But I've only been able to find the time to explore the history recently. And more recently, I've decided I need proper supervision and guidance. So I've enrolled to do an MA by research at Leeds University, supervised by Alexia Moncrief and Will Jackson. So I'm in the early stages of this journey, and it's exactly the right time to be chatting about it with the Thoresby Society. So I'll share my screen and we'll spend the next 15 minutes or so on this. So you may notice at the top I've expanded the dates slightly, but I will be focusing mainly on the first third of the 20th century. I'm going to talk a little about the house itself and the family who bequeathed it to the city. I'll give you a brief history of tuberculosis, dwell a little bit longer on the whole idea of the pre-tuberculous child, which was a notion that had its day in the sun, but has been largely forgotten now. Talk about what was the Hollies? Was it a sanatorium school, an open-air school, or a preventorium? And finally, as you might expect from a paediatrician, I'll ask in whose best interests this institution was set up and did it actually work. So many of you will have enjoyed walking in the grounds of the Hollies on the western side of Meanwood Beck, and quite a few of you will know the memorial plaques on Wheatwood Lane, and they tell us that the grounds and house were given by George William Brown in honour of his son Major Harold Brown, who was killed in the First World War. Some reports state that Harold was his only son, but there was another son who survived the war but had such severe post-traumatic stress that he was deemed unfit to inherit. George William was so generous that he bought another 9 acres of land on the eastern side of the Beck, just so he could give that to the city so the people of Meanwood could have unimpeded access to the grounds. His only precondition was that there should be no intoxicants sold in the park. Just going back a generation, George William's father, William Brown, was born in Kendal in 1805, but lived most of his life in Leeds. He made the family money as a partner in Stansfeld Brown and Company, who were stuff merchants. William was a Unitarian, a magistrate, a moderate liberal, and much involved in the running of Leeds General Infirmary as its treasurer for many years. And he lived in some style, I think, at Barden Grange in Wheatwood, and had the Hollies built for George William and his family. Now, the Thoresby Society has already embraced George William's only sister, Jane Elizabeth Brown, as one of your people of Leeds. She devoted a lot of time and energy to the Victoria Home in Headingley, which she founded and ran as a permanent home for chronically sick and disabled women of education and status. But sadly, 1921, the year that he handed over the Hollies to the city, turned out to be another tragic year for George William. His sister Jane died at 73. That was probably not too bad. But then his daughter Jean Millicent died aged 34 under the wheels of an underground train in London. The coroner's verdict was suicide. George William appealed to the Lord Chancellor to have the verdict overturned to one of accidental death. His appeal was not granted. So this family were all but destroyed by the First World War and its aftermath. But what became of the Hollies after it was bequeathed to the city? In 1921, the plan was that the house would be used on a temporary basis as a hostel for student teachers. This didn't happen due to a bureaucratic wrangle between Leeds and Whitehall, so it wasn't until 1925 that the building opened as a Preventorium. But at least the grounds were being well used, with the addition of tennis courts and a bowling green and talk of a bird sanctuary, all reported in the Yorkshire Post and Leeds Intelligencer. So just turning our attention back to TB for a moment, tuberculosis was and is a big killer. If you look at the WHO website today, you will find that about a quarter of the world's population are infected with TB. However, most of these people are well and don't know they're infected. However, lots of people are sick with TB, and an estimated 1.5 million people died of TB in 2020. It's second only to COVID-19 as an infectious cause of death worldwide. But that's the world. But in Leeds, things are not like that anymore. We don't have much TB compared to where we were 100 years ago. So until Robert Koch discovered the TB bacillus, pictured above, in 1882, TB was commonly thought to be an inherited disease. Tuberculosis was responsible for 1 in 8 deaths in the first decade of the 20th century in Britain. It was the single biggest killer of men and the second biggest killer of women. It was much less of a killer of children, and their pattern of disease was and is different. So I have to imagine 100 years ago, most Leeds children breathed in some TB bugs, got what's called a primary infection in their lungs, which their immune systems managed to sort out and seal off. A few, often those whose immunity was impaired by poor nutrition or measles or other illnesses, didn't manage to contain the infection, and it progressed, sometimes via the bloodstream, to cause much more serious disease. I should add that quite a few Leeds children were infected by bovine TB from contaminated milk, but that's a whole other story. So Koch's discovery sparked a revolution in the fight against TB. I'd like to say that Leeds was in the forefront of this, but we weren't. It was in Edinburgh that Dr. later Sir Robert Phillip developed a model tuberculosis service, which became the template for towns and cities in the rest of the country. Starting as early as 1887, he developed a central clinic, home visiting, specialist hospital and sanatorium, which were all part of an integrated system of care. Robert Phillip said that many children with primary infections should be regarded as, quote, seedlings, some of whom would progress to become ill with TB as young adults. So he thought that about 30% of all children might be pre-tuberculous. Faced with such large numbers of poor children who are household contacts of adults with TB, how on earth could doctors, nurses and schools and TB clinics decide which children were, quotes, pre-tuberculous? So the breakthrough came in 1907 when von Perke, an Austrian paediatrician who had worked with Koch, was able to demonstrate that many children who had been exposed to TB showed a positive skin reaction to injected tuberculin. So here at last was the sort of test that the doctors were looking for, something to help them decide which children were pre-tuberculous and needed some sort of intervention. James Kerr was a pioneering doctor in Bradford who the Bradford School Health Service in the 1910s was ahead of most of the rest of the country. and Kerr himself moved on to London to take on the London School Health Service. But he described these children as children with easy fatigue and exhaustion, poor colour, earthy greenish complexions and various catarrhal conditions, ill nourished with poor appetite, losing weight, and so on. And then, so by the time the Hollies finally opened in 1925, our school medical officer, who was Dr. Algernon Weir, wrote in his annual report, there are the very precise number of 658 pre-tubercular children registered for admission, who could be improved in health and in some cases have their lives saved by residence for a few months in an open-air school. There were 40 places at the Hollies. So open-air schools, well, when I first started in the school medical service, which I have to say wasn't as early as this, 1986 was when I got a bit of training, I was told that it all started with the Boer War. It was such a shock to the British government to realise how many potential recruits to the armed forces were unfit to serve, that it was decided that something had to be done. The health of British children had to improve, so more of them were fit enough to staff the empire and or to die as soldiers. And this can be seen as part of the whole national efficiency movement, which many of you will be familiar with in the run-up to the First World War. Well, that was certainly part of the story, but in fact general concerns about the health of school children go back well into the end of the 19th century. We don't have time to look at this in detail, but there was a lot of worry about ventilation, overcrowding, inadequate nutrition, and the sheer numbers of impoverished children whose ability to learn in the elementary schools was hampered by hunger, illness, and disability. Open-air schools became the flavour of the decade in the 1910s, inspired by places like Charlottenburg in Germany, and embraced with enthusiasm in North America, starting on Coney Island near New York. Once the idea got going, nearly every town and city felt they should have at least one, but we didn't get ours in Leeds until 1925, so the Hollies was definitely late to the party. Some historians argue that part of the attraction of an open-air school was a romantic harking back to an imagined rural idyll before all the downsides of urbanisation. But it's also true that there were plenty of genuine good news stories, featuring pale waifs from the inner cities being transformed by fresh air, sunlight and food into rosy-cheeked lads and lasses full of vigour and vitality. The word Preventorium was widely used in North America, and it simply meant an open-air school for pre-tuberculous children. The 1914-18 war was dreadful. The flu pandemic that followed was a disaster. So it's not surprising that by 1920, finding ways to prevent and treat infectious diseases was an urgent priority. Tuberculosis was already in decline, but those doctors and nurses who survived the war and the pandemic returned to battle against TB with renewed determination. So the Hollies was always a hybrid institution, taking children who already had TB, who needed a sanatorium school, and those who were thought to be pre-tuberculous, who needed an open-air school or Preventorium. So thanks to the West Yorkshire Archives and with permission from Leeds City Council, I've been able to look at the logbook for the Hollies from 1925 onwards, and more usefully the register of the children who stayed there from 1934, both of which are confidential. I will do some basic statistics which should give me insights into the health and progress of these children. The reports of the Education Board in Whitehall by Dr. Muriel Bywaters, the visiting inspector of such schools, make fascinating reading. She was like a one-woman Ofsted. I've been able to compare her assessments of similar institutions across West Yorkshire. Dr. Bywater stayed in the same role for at least 20 years and made some very helpful recommendations about diet, education, and welfare. She comes across as forthright, thoughtful, and compassionate. Her reports indicate that she liked what she saw of the Hollies. But was the Preventorium at the Hollies in the best interests of the children? One of the people who Dr. Bywaters commends in her reports is Dr. Norman Tattersall, who was the medical officer for tuberculosis for Leeds for many years and visited the Hollies about once a week. He turns out to have been a bit of a national expert on Preventoria and published an article about them in 1932, following a fact-finding visit to North America. In his article, he asked whether the right children were being admitted. Was it logical to admit the children with a positive skin test, i.e. those who had some immunity, or should they actually have been admitting those children from TB households with a negative skin test, those who didn't have strong enough immunity to show a skin reaction were quite possibly more at risk of their infection progressing? The whole rationale for Preventoria was seriously undermined in the mid-1930s by studies from the US, which showed no better outcomes for the children in the Preventoria than for those who stayed at home. As often happens, new evidence takes a while to filter through, and of course, many institutions develop a life of their own, providing employment and often attracting charitable funds for treats and outings for the children, etc. In the late 1940s, specific antibiotics for TB were discovered, and by the early 1950s they were generally available, and the Hollies closed as a Preventorium in 1956. I expect that most of you are thinking, hang on, this was a residential institution for children. Some were as young as 2 years old. Never mind the tuberculosis, what about their emotional welfare? The children often stayed for months, some for over a year. Did each child have a mother figure during their stay? How often were relatives allowed to visit? I'm exploring these questions. Most of the children's voices from the 20s and 30s have now passed on. I wrote an article in the Yorkshire Evening Post in 2019 asking for people to get in touch, and following this I have spoken to a handful of people who stayed at the Hollies in the 40s and 50s. Most, but not all, of their memories are good. Was it in the best interests of the children? It's difficult to know. There's no simple answer. It will have depended a lot on the individual, family and institutional variables. My research will delve deeper into the social, educational and health perspectives of this fascinating chapter in the local history of our responses to another pandemic disease. I would be very interested to hear from all of you as local historians about other potential sources of information, and of course I'd love to find memoirs or diaries of people who stayed at the Hollies as children in the 20s and 30s. I'd particularly like to thank David Cooper, the owner of the Hollies, who showed me around. I'm not sure if he's able to join us this evening. To my two supervisors, Alexia and Will, to the archives, the City Council and the library, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that most interesting talk. We already have a question from Linda Kitching, who asked, was the Hollies staffed mostly by teachers or by medical staff?
That's a really important question, and it fascinates me. So the person in charge was a teacher, and it was a registered school, not a registered health institution. But there was also a sort of matron type person, and then the sort of helpers. There was, most of the time, there was at least one assistant teacher, if not two, and then there was a cook and one or two people who were probably without skills, but were there as sort of mother figures, I guess. And what else was I going to say? No, that was a bit. That was your staff. Yes.
So Pat has asked, which areas did the children come from? All of
All
Leeds?
all areas. I mean, the addresses are in the register, and most of the addresses I recognise as a community paediatrician, but some were from those areas which have subsequently been pulled down. So certainly, very much largely the slum areas, if I'm allowed to say that. I think I am.
Another comment, fascinating talk. Did any families refuse to let their children go?
I think so, yes. And quite a few removed their children. Often there would be a little splurge of so-and-so's gone to Seacroft with diphtheria, and then the next day somebody else has gone to Seacroft with diphtheria, and then the next day 3 children were withdrawn by their parents, who not unreasonably thought, well, if my child's going to catch diphtheria in this place, I'm going to move them. There's only one record of a child running away.
Right. Thank you for that. I'm looking to see whether some more questions. There are some very comments, which I'll pass on to you after the meeting, I think. But there's a question, what happened when the children moved back to their impoverished home? Did the spell at the Preventorium help them?
I think the answer to that is probably yes, because it was part of an integrated system. So we still have TB health visitors now, and there would be follow-up into the children's homes. And while the children were in hospital, in most places, I haven't actually got the evidence for Leeds, but I've no reason to think it's not the case, there would be home visits going on to see how the poorly adults were getting on, and also to educate about ventilation, about hygiene, about food, etc. So considerable efforts were made to improve the home for the children to go back to.
So Rebecca asks, did they segregate the children according to their immunity status?
No, they didn't. Children with TB are rarely infectious to other people, unless, I think when you get to be sort of 14, 15, you might be more infectious like an adult. So they tried not to have children with sort of open TB, as you might say. So I don't think there was any segregation. Segregation was according to boys and girls. Also, certainly some of the older girls were encouraged, possibly expected, to act as older siblings to the younger children.
So are there any more questions? Oh, another question. Yes, good question. How important was the decent food, assuming it was, compared with the fresh air?
Yeah, there was a huge debate going on in the 10s and 20s about this, and a lot of people were saying it's the food that matters. But I think it was probably both. But my gut feeling is probably the food was more important than the fresh air. Although some of these houses were, of course, very ill ventilated, and certainly Muriel Bywater's comments on the menus quite a lot. So wherever she visits, there's usually some comment on there should be a bit more fresh fruit and vegetables and a bit less suet in this diet.
So was the school financed out of the Leeds rates?
Yes, it was.
So
there was a complicated system with Whitehall, so you got some sort of a grant as well. And certainly in the 10s and 20s, Whitehall were very strongly encouraging open air schools. It was definitely the flavour of the month.
Another question, can you give a general idea of the general staff to children ratio?
I would think it was something like 1 to 8 adults to children. I'm not sure how many people were on at night time.
Right, and there's a question, did any Jewish children get admitted, and in which case were their dietary and other needs met?
I think that's a very good question. I think, possibly a little bit shocked in the 10s and 20s to find that the schools were classified in about 4 different labels, one of which was Jewish schools. So it seemed to be an administrative category in Leeds. When I've looked through the register for 1934 to 36, there's a column for religion, and I haven't found Jewish once. I have interviewed one person who was Jewish, who was there with her sibling in 1948. So things may have changed late in the day, but I suspect that that it wasn't typical for Jewish children to come in the 30s, which is what I've got the register for.
And then just a final question, it's not really part of your remit, but what is happening at the Hollies now?
Well, it's a private house. I don't know if David is here. He would have commented by now, I think. It was sold to him about 8 years ago. After it stopped being a Preventorium, it was a children's home. It was a refuge for women. It's been an old people's home, but it's now a private house with a number of apartments that are let out.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for that most interesting